Welcome to the WorkFusion Virtual Summit. I'm really, really happy that we're doing this in the midst of what are obviously very, very unusual times. But I'm here to essentially share two messages with you. One is that these may be unusual times, but these are the most important times for us as leaders to be thinking about transformation. And then the second thing that I want to share with you is that there are very strong proven approaches on how to be successful at digital transformation. And I'm hoping to share some of my experiences regarding that. But I want to kind of back us up a little bit and address the fact that these are indeed unusual times. For God's sake, who would have expected 3 months ago that a CEO meeting would turn out to be something like this?
What if I crashed a real corporate Zoom meeting? We found an insider at a company called Tibco.
I asked Dan to join us today, and he was gracious enough to do it.
Absolutely, Mark. Look, doing my best to join as many of these, our local team calls as possible. But preparing now, like Mark said, on things like our strategic account action plans that support our customers' goals. We're in a great place to be able to support and work with our communities.
I want to apologize. I'm late for the meeting. I'm new to the company. I wanted to break in mostly because it's pretty clear that Dan has lost his way with Tibco. I mean, if you have to put the name of your company on a bar behind you, things are getting sad.
Right. So, so it's a new world. But the thing that I want to share with you is that if there's one thing that we've learned from past economic crises, such as the 2008 crisis, it is that you have to choose to play to win rather than choose not to lose. This is basically context for where we're at in the current crisis. We're just at stage 2 of 4 stages here. After the first few scramble to make sure everybody can get onto Zoom and everybody can actually order from our company, we now move to stage 2, which is sustain whatever urgent business pivots that we need to make. But make no mistake, we still have 2 stages ahead of us. We're still going to have to all streamline. All of the money that is being spent, either as a government or as a company, is going to have to be addressed. And so we still have productivity as a concern ahead of us. And then eventually, the 4th stage, which is supplant, which is transform the way we run ourselves much, much more, cost effectively, much, much more productively than we have in the past. And so going back to previous lessons, I mentioned that, the big lesson from the 2008 economic crisis was that companies that came out winners at the end of that crisis actually accelerated profitability during the recession, right? And so this idea that all we need to do is hunker down and then, when the new normal comes across, we will scramble and do something magical, that's actually a mistake, right? The model that I like to use is one that has been proven both in my own experience over the last 30 years, but also by economists, which is depending on the financial strength of your organization, as well as where you are in the market. So if you are pretty good from a financial strength standpoint and you have great market share, you obviously have much more degrees of freedom. You can disproportionately invest in IT, and you can jump ahead of your competition in terms of new digital business models. But if you happen to be on the other end of the spectrum, you're ahead. You have to go ahead and drive much more cost reduction, and then of course be very selective about how you're going to transform. But again, make no mistake, the crisis, the economic crisis, has not just made digital transformation important, it has made it important and urgent, which is all good and fine. This was my first of 2 messages. But the second message there is, how do you do that when your best strategy to survive an industrial revolution such as digital transformation still has a 70% failure rate? So this is really where I'm going to go to my second message, which is there are some proven experiences that can help you along the way. And I like to talk about that in the context of a 5-stage model, which is what I'm going to do next. We talk about digital transformation as if it was one thing for everybody. In reality, it is not. And over a period of many years and through a lot of research, I have basically figured out that you have to be very clear on what stage you're at. And in every stage, I have identified 2 very important strategies that you can adopt to make sure that you're successful at that stage. But I'm going to step back a little bit because I'm guilty of having actually jumped ahead without the proper introduction. So this is a little bit about myself. I've had the pleasure of essentially having worked with Procter & Gamble for 27 years. I was vice president in IT and global business services. But more importantly, I feel like I grew up with that industry of IT and shared services. So I was based in the Philippines in 1993 and was responsible for setting up the first ever offshore shared services center. And then, when the big wave of outsourcing came about, I was based in Cincinnati. I was program manager globally for leading the outsourcing of 2/3 of IT and shared services at Procter & Gamble. This was a 10-year, $8 billion deal with HP and IBM and Jones Lang LaSalle. And then I kind of got into more operational roles of running IT and shared services in every region of the world before, eventually kind of getting into the space of realization that we're in the midst of an industrial revolution. And so we have to do a little more than run operations. So that's a little bit of my background. A little more about Procter & Gamble as a company. This was a company that needs no introduction, but for those of you that are in the operations area, global business services is a very large operation, $2 billion, about 15,000 FTE, both insourced and outsourced across 50 countries. And then, of course, the ironic challenge that I was referring to that came about towards the end of my P&G career was the realization that externally the world might think of P&G's IT and GBS as best in class. But the ironic challenge is if you're best in class, what do you do next? We all know as leaders that, sitting on your laurels is not an option anymore. And so we set about creating the equivalent of Google X, which is a 10x disruptive industry ecosystem, except that, instead of working on cool things like driverless cars and balloon internet, we decided to work on something a little more boring, such as, accounting and IT operations and, so on and so forth. So the story that I'm going to share with you comes from my experience of having to say, okay, how do I get to that next 10x improvement in internal business operations, not the next 10%, but the 10 times. And the outcome of some of the work that we did at Procter & Gamble was to basically reimagine internal business operations. So, really disruptive questions like, how would you run AI-based call centers rather than just mostly people-based? How would you apply the concept of finally real-time supply chain planning instead of the siloed, MRP to demand forecasting, demand planning, so on and so forth. And, how do you eventually get to 100% accuracy on master data and many others, right? So that's really the story that I'd like to share with you. So getting us back into the stage one of how, which is if you do have to disrupt your operations, you have to work your way through foundation, which is automation of your processes. Siloed, which is you have to start with maybe parts of your organization's operations, and you have to be successful at not just continually improving them, but in disrupting them, right? Stage 3, which is then you have to, across the entire company, synchronize your transformation so that you have a common business strategy, not just a common shared services strategy, but a common business strategy. How do you essentially get to the one-time, fully transformed operation of the future? But most importantly, how do you get to then stage 5, which is not just transforming technology and business processes, but transforming entire organizations, so the whole culture, so that ongoing disruption becomes the living DNA of the company. These are the 5 stages. And what I'd like to do next is kind of work my way through each of these stages and give you some real life examples of my own lessons of what it takes to be successful. I mentioned at the outset that every stage really has 2 disciplines. I won't have time to go through all 10 disciplines, but I can talk to at least one of the 2 disciplines at every stage. So at stage 1, we are simply trying to automate the processes of the organization. What's most important is, of course, following an iterative execution, not just a waterfall plan and then eventually do a big bang. But as we all know through Agile and other stuff today, you have to be iterative. But then secondly, the other discipline, which is what I want to focus on, is the difference being committed as a leader versus being involved as a leader. So let's talk about committed ownership. To do that, I'd like to essentially draw us further back from the circumstances of our day-to-day life and talk about what's happening in the world around us, right? We all hear these and read about these snippets of information of, how 5 of the top 10 companies in the world today are technology companies. And by the way, that doesn't include Amazon and Alibaba, so that would be 7 out of the top 10. But that, 8 years ago, there was only 1 in that list, which is Microsoft. So in other words, Wall Street is rewarding technology companies. And it's doing that for a very good reason, which is that when you look at the operations of companies, entire chunks of operations, starting with supply chain here, are being totally disrupted. Because if a fashion retailer, Zara, can go from designing new clothes to actually having them in stock in store within 2 weeks, that means supply chain as we know it is being done very differently. And by the way, it's not just supply chain, because if Chinese cell phone manufacturer can essentially have new batches, I'm not talking about new versions of software, but new batches of phones available every week, it means that research and development is happening differently. And it's just not just internal functions of these companies, it's entire industries, because we all know the statistics, 40 to 50% of jobs in entire industries, transportation, manufacturing, retail, are going to be done by software robots. What this tells us is that industries are being disrupted. And it's not just our work life, but our personal lives as well, being disrupted. Because, just to give you an example, we have 2 daughters, and they're 25 and 26. They don't use wealth management companies to advise them on financial planning. They use AI, right? And so we see this change happening in our personal lives as well. We see this happening in society in general, because if you have, 24 million people in the US in the next 7 years who are going to be less literate than computers, that's going to cause a lot of angst. And that's what we see play out in, the World Forum at a social level today, right? So I realize I'm drifting a little bit from, internal business operations in companies, but I'm doing that for a reason. And that reason is to make a point that this is an industrial revolution. This struck me in 2015 while I was at Procter & Gamble, when I set out to answer the question of, okay, so if I'm pretty good at business operations, what's next for me, right? And I went out and talked to 100 different entities, venture capitalists, consultancies, peer organizations. And among those were this small company called Wanolo, and specifically their CEO, a guy named AJ Brustein, who's a good friend now. And we went back and forth on email trying to figure out a time for us to connect. And you can see that on the screen there. And I know it's just a boring email where I say, when are you available? He says, I'm not available this week. I said, fine, and then he asks who I assume is his admin to go ahead and set up some time. And you see his admin's email down there. The point of this story is it took me a while to realize that Amy Ingram, who I assumed was his admin, was actually a robot. Now, look at that email. There's nothing in that email to even clue you into the fact that I was dealing with a robot. When I say I'm not available a certain week, none of these options for scheduling are in that week. So this robot understands context. This robot also understands pretty good business English, right? And then ask yourself a question. Which are some of the most sensitive jobs in a company? The admin assistant, probably to the CEO, is one of those. And if you have got organizations in 2015, look at the date up there, April 10th, 2015. If you have some companies that were using robots to do that 5 years ago, it basically made me realize that the issue is no longer technology. When we ask ourselves, is technology ready? We're asking the wrong question. Technology is more ready than we are. It is our job as leaders to figure out where we're going to use that technology, right? So that was insight number one. And it drove a whole lot of other insights for me, relating back to that good old thing called Moore's Law, which basically is now to the point where, you know, you can go out for $1,000 very soon in 2023 and buy the computing capacity of an entire human brain, which is mind-boggling by itself, but it gets worse or better depending on where you're coming from, because, you know, in a short 27 years after that, you're going to be able to go out and buy for $1,000 the computing capacity of all humans on Earth. So in my world today, where I consult with, you know, maybe about 20 of the Fortune 100 CEO board level companies, the number one question I get asked is, what should be my organization strategy if I'm faced with the question of $1,000 computers or hiring people in the next few years, right? That is the fourth industrial revolution. That's why I was sharing all of that context of, you know, being able to use AI for, you know, wealth planning and, you know, human literacy and things like that. We're in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution. And unlike the previous three industrial revolutions that were based by steam, electric, and the internet-based technology, this one is basically eating all of those technologies, because when you have Facebook, you know, that's digital technology eating social technology, right? That's what digital transformation is all about. It is about rewiring ourselves as human beings, as office workers, and as leaders to not just survive, but thrive in this era of digital disruption. In other words, digital disruption is the fourth industrial revolution. Digital transformation is our response to that, right? And as business operations leaders, if we don't really comprehend that that's what this is, it's not about a technology, it's not about blockchain, it's not about RPA, it is about what you do as a leader to essentially rewire the company. That is our job. Then the question becomes, okay, how do you do that and not fail 70% of the time? Which gets me to, you know, the most important discipline at stage one digital transformation, which is committed ownership. This is not something you can delegate. Sure, you can delegate things like running the operations. You can delegate even updating your systems. But this strategy of how do I rewire the company has to come from you as a leader. That's what commitment is. That's not just involvement. That is strategy setting, right? And that's the first discipline that I'd like to talk about. Stage two is when the company then, or the organization that then gets into the mode of driving 10x change, 10x type of change in parts of the organization. So taking a part of a work process maybe and saying, you know, can I disrupt it? Can I make this 10 times better? And to do that, there are two disciplines that are important. One is you have to understand where to apply technology. That's what I call digital leverage point. But the second, which I want to focus on next, is you have to then empower the right people in your organization to not just improve stuff incrementally 10%, but to improve them 10 times. In my work about 5 years ago, when I was sharing some of these stories about Amy, the robot admin assistant, I came across Google's model of 70-20-10, where At Google, they have this mindset of, spend 70% of the capacity on day-to-day operations, 20% on continuous improvement, and then 10% on disrupting yourself. Now, again, we're not Google. We don't have 10% of a budget to devote to disrupting yourself. But the point is, the numbers don't matter. It is these three parts of your management strategy that matter. You have to have a certain part of your strategy as a leader that's about operations, a certain part of it as continuous improvement. And if you were a leader 5 years ago, it would be fine to just have those two. In an industrial revolution, you have to have part three, which is disruption, right? And certainly that's true for internal business operations. So at Procter & Gamble in shared services, this wasn't 10% of our budget. It was probably more like 19.9, and then 0.1% in terms of investment. But we did have three parts to that strategy. And we did have an empowered organization to go about and do that. And the way we did that was we essentially took, out of the 5,000 FTEs in global business services, we just took like a dozen very senior, very credible people, and we put them aside into what's called an edge organization. And it's called the edge because they are given freedom to operate somewhere on the edges where they're looking outside as much as they're looking inside, as a way to essentially do things 10 times better. And what you do is you create a framework that, provides them not forgiveness, but amnesty for a certain period of time against things like, oh, it's going to take you 3 months to qualify a vendor, right? Or you cannot do this in terms of, info security. You have to essentially create a sandbox, right? And the third thing you need to do to essentially empower disruptive innovation is to then add to those few people an ecosystem of unlimited capacity of vendors, suppliers, and the rest of the world that allows them to do things disruptively. And the best way I can share how this works is through a video here.
So today I'm going to be counting down my top 5 failed Google X Labs projects. Project number 1 is the space elevator. So X considered making a space elevator for a good amount of time, and basically the essential idea of this is that there was an elevator that would take you from the ground of the earth up into orbit. Project number 2 is a jetpack. So X actually researched into making a consumer-friendly jetpack for quite a while. Project number 3 is Foghorn. So essentially the project of Foghorn was to turn seawater into fuel. Project number 4 is a hoverboard. And project number 5 is teleportation. X actually looked into researching and developing teleportation.
So the reason I wanted to share that is, when we hear about companies like Netflix and Google and so on and so forth, and all of these crazy things that they do, they are clearly able to compartmentalize the day-to-day operations, which are very, very robust, right? So the 70%, they're able to compartmentalize the 20%. And they're able to then have a third part of their organization, which could be a very, very small investment for most organizations, that can think of these crazy ideas like teleportation. And they have to be crazy because, your job as a leader is to go through all of these disruptive possibilities and to kill most of them very quickly, so that what you end up with is, the 1 or 2 ideas that are definitely crazy, but they are ready enough to be implemented now. And that's what gets you to the driverless car, right? So let's move on to stage 3, which is partially synchronized. This is when, you've taken your little edge organization and you have parts of your organization now operating in a disruptive manner, right? At that stage, you have to then think in terms of change management. Your challenge is to then scale that kind of technology and that kind of thinking across the organization, as well as you have to think in terms of strategy sufficiency. We know that 99% of all these big ideas, they fail in large organizations because it's very easy to do quick proof of concepts, which are great, but then the minute you try and bring them back into the organization, you just don't have enough money or capacity or people to basically scale them. That's where the concept of strategy sufficiency comes in. And I'd like to share my own example from Procter & Gamble of how we address this. with a small percentage of the organization working on this, there's no way you're going to have enough resources to do that. So what you do then is you build an ecosystem, right? In our case, what we did was I went to the biggest scale partners, IT partners that worked with us, Ernst & Young and Tata and Infosys and so on and so forth, and said, I'd like to offer you Procter & Gamble as a disruptive innovation playing ground. So I want you to bring your own people and resources and play with us and work on real use cases. And oh, by the way, if you're successful, you can share with the gains, right? That's honestly what we did, because Procter & Gamble Global Business Services is not an IT company. I had no interest in actually using the intellectual property and selling software, but these guys did, and so they were very motivated to come in and bring their own money and people to do that. The second group that I went to was venture capitalists, not the VC guys that give you money, but the VC guys that essentially put on their hat of, I want to give my startups the ability to work with large companies and to showcase their products, right? And so that's what they did. They brought us the most disruptive ideas. And so when you bring that together with a handful of your own resources, and you create a working model and a platform that allows us to essentially tap into all of that wealth, then of course, suddenly you're no longer just a dozen people, you are hundreds of people with a lot of money across the world to do that. And that's basically what we did in the case of Procter & Gamble. You have to then run that entire ecosystem as if you were a venture capitalist in the world, in the sense that, you can come out with 10 crazy ideas, but my job was to essentially kill at least half of those immediately, and then maybe another 4 out of the remaining 5 in the next few weeks. So what you're then left with is one viable idea, which is a tens of millions of dollars big, right? And that ecosystem is very important, because it doesn't matter if you have the smartest people in the world. It doesn't matter if you have the most billions of dollars in the world. You still have to recognize that 99.99999% of the resources and money are outside your boundaries. And it's your job as a leader to essentially tap into that money. And there's one other reason why you have to build an ecosystem. And I'd like to share that by giving you the example of the 2008-2009 BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. The world was looking for a quick solution to plug that oil well, and none of the traditional resources in the world could figure out how to do that. So they put a $1 million prize called an X Prize to come out with the ideas. And this is how it worked.
Over 350 teams from around the globe submitted to enter. 10 were selected to bring their technology to compete. Every single one a fresh idea. And the best of the best earns a $1 million prize.
So they did this X Prize, and they were actually able to identify a small little company that came out with a winning solution, which is what got used. But the reason I share this with you is that the 2 people in that small company that came out with this idea, one of them was a dentist, the other one was a tattoo artist. Neither of them, to my knowledge, had deep expertise in the Gulf of Mexico or firefighting, or they weren't even from the oil industry. But clearly there was a parallel between maybe fluid dynamics, in dentistry or tattoo ink, and an oil spill that allowed you to come out with that disruptive idea. That's the other reason why you have to create an ecosystem. You want different ideas. Your best-in-class experts will tell you how to do things well based on best-in-class current knowledge. If you want to disrupt, you do have to go outside. Which just gets into stage 4, which is, all right, fine. So now you have a large part of your organization all rowing in the same direction. You have scaled this change, and you have essentially found a way to get everybody to disrupt themselves, right? There are 2 disciplines then you need at that stage. One is you have to stay current, And then the second, which is what I want to talk about, is then you have to reorganize the way you think about IT and technology. One little IT function in the company, in these types of organizations, cannot do all of the technology work that's required for the whole company to keep disrupting themselves. In my case, I want to share with you some examples of the kind of actual projects that we implemented. So this was an idea that was implemented using artificial intelligence for accounts receivables. Now, in most large companies, or in most companies that have an accounts receivables organization, they also have something of a challenge with disputes management. So, you know, you shipped a customer a good, they paid you back, except that what you paid back was not exactly what you were expecting. And then that becomes a dispute. And then you have to figure out, you know, how to have your army of accounts receivables people and their army of accounts payables people resolve this issue. The challenge in this case is, isn't this all just data? The data of whether a claim is valid or not should be in somebody's system. It should be either in, you know, your customer systems or your system or the bank system or the transporter system. And that's what we did. We found, you know, a small startup in Silicon Valley that specialized just in this use case of disputes for accounts receivables. And in large companies where you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in cash being locked up, you know, this can be breakthrough. And that's why this is something that got used at Procter & Gamble in Europe and in Latin America and parts of North America. Another example, successful example, was artificial intelligence for call centers. Now, I'm not talking about the IT internal support help desk. I'm talking about the call center where, you know, you're a consumer of P&G shampoo and you call a number or you send an email to the company. And life for those people that are in that contact center can be, you know, a little complicated, because not only are you dealing with, you know, a range of questions that go from, hey, my baby's diaper seems to be leaking, you know, a little too much, what do I do? All the way through, you know, a call from some corner of the world saying, hey, you know, can you tell me if this ingredient in this shampoo was sourced sustainably from Indonesia, right? And so it's impossible to deal with that range of questions, except that, again, there is technology. There is technology that could do voice to text, even as the call or the email comes in, to have the technology go in and feed that into your call management system. In our case, voice to text. And because we're a little crazy, we test this out in China with you know, Mandarin to English data entry. So you don't need those operators doing data entry 100% of the time. The second technology that exists is knowledge management. So if you took a few keywords and then had knowledge management go in and get the answers in real time or as soon as possible, then those agents on the phone or on email become very powerful sales or equity extensions of the company. And so that's what we did. That is the technology that is in use in several countries in the world right now. Another example is global ocean shipping. You know, if you're a large company that's sourcing from all over the world, you're very familiar with the challenge of, you know, customs and freight forwarding and trying to understand where in the world your ship is and, you know, so on and so forth, right? This was a challenge that IBM and Maersk, the ocean shipping company, had recognized, and they had already started to build in 2016 this joint venture where they would take a blockchain and have all of these different entities put the latest validated information. So, you know, you could access this. And this is breakthrough. But the additional idea that we had at Procter & Gamble was, if you have that information available, then why would you not disrupt accounting and invoicing? Because if you're a supplier of mine based in China, And across that entire supply chain, from the supplier to the freight forwarder, to the customs, to the shipper, I have validated information. Then why do I want you to waste your time raising invoices on me? And why do I want me to waste my time processing those invoices? And that's exactly what we did. When I left Procter & Gamble, this was in use in 15 shipping lanes as a test. And a final example, how would you use AI for your own employees? So the traditional example is one of a new hire. You know, if they join your company, you have 10 different systems, one for security, one for payroll, you know, one for onboarding, one for getting a PC. And rather than having 10 different systems, could you not have, you know, the equivalent of an AI bot that negotiates with these 10 systems? So all you have to do is say, I have employee ABC, social security number, you know, so and so, joining on such and such a date, and then the process kicks off, right? And that's exactly what we did as well. Now, the reason I want to share some of these examples, and you know, the quilt here is another 20, 25 projects that we did, is because there's no way on earth one IT organization with limited capacity could ever do all of this work. Your job in stage 4 organizations is for IT or shared services to become an enabler, and for the people that do these processes on a day-to-day basis, part of their capacity needs to be devoted to essentially driving this disruption, right? So in other words, the digital reorganization is from you being a bottleneck, transforming yourself to being an enabler, right? And that's basically what stage 4 success is all about, which essentially gets us to stage 5, which is when you then become, you know, a constant disruptor organization. Disruption becomes the living DNA. And there's only one quick slide that I want to share to basically illustrate that. It's a law that is very close to my heart. It's called Martek's law. What it says is that technology changes exponentially, but organizations change logarithmically. Actually, logarithmically is actually worse than linearly, because in a logarithmic graph, it flattens after some time. And what this illustrates for you as a change leader is that the longer you wait to delay disruption of yourself, the harder you make it on your organization. So in other words, iterative change, iterative execution is necessary not just for technology, but also for organization change, right? And that's really, really important, because the message here has got to be, you know, you have to have not just yourself as an IT or shared services organization embrace technology, but you have to have your entire company embrace technology. And I'd like to share you a small little cute video to make that point. All right. So, you know, obviously, I don't expect each one of you to be like little Raina and go around saying, I love you, robot. And oh, by the way, when you do embrace technology, make sure it's the right technology. I think in this case, she was embracing not a robot, but a water heater, if I'm not mistaken. But it's the sentiment that matters. I mean, you really, really do want to make sure that you got everybody embracing technology. And that's basically the summary of, you know, what are the 10 disciplines and what you have to ensure as you're kind of going up that particular checklist. And that's, again, available in more detail in the whole model. It's available online. It's available in my book, Why Digital Transformations Fail. But I want to bring us back to today. So, you know, as I mentioned, if there's one thing that we've learned from previous economic crises, it is the seeds of change have to start at the time when you're in the crisis, right? So in other words, the crisis has not postponed digital disruption. It has accelerated digital disruption. And the second message is that how you do that, the execution methodology is what is key. Because if we're in the midst of an industrial revolution, if you had admin assistants that were robots 5 years ago, if you can do essentially, dispute management of invoices using artificial intelligence, if you can essentially have stand-up comedians that are AI robots, then we certainly as leaders can reimagine and lead the transformation to a different future. And oh, by the way, I wasn't kidding about the AI robot that's a stand-up comedian. I'd like to end by essentially showing you how that works.
Lolbot is amazing at riffing as well, so this is a really great opportunity. So if anyone's got any topics, just yell them out. Whoa, okay, I heard global warming.
I have been programmed to operate in temperatures in excess of 90 degrees Celsius. But you guys are ha 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 ha.
Lolbot uses stochastic modeling to pull data from this enormous library of content that's available to him, thousands of hours of shows, and it uses deep learning algorithms to tease out the meaning from those comedy shows and try and generate new jokes.
See me, Lolbot, at the Melbourne International Comedy Festival. Death to all humans. Ha ha ha. Ha ha ha.
So that's it. Hey, stay safe, stay disruptive in your strategies, and enjoy the rest of the conference.